Welcome to the Clinical Education Initiative podcast, Conversations with CEI, where we feature conversations with clinical experts, their experience and insights on current health issues in the areas of HIV, primary care and prevention, sexual health, hepatitis C, and drug user health.
Hello, this is Dr. Stephen Fine, podcasting on behalf of the New York State AIDS Institute Clinical Education Initiative. Today's topic is what your HIV patients should know about the measles. I don't know about you, but I'm getting a lot of questions about measles lately, given big outbreaks of measles that have been highly publicized going on in the southern United States, namely Texas. In this podcast, I'm going to talk a little bit about what is the measles, clinically speaking. What was measles like before vaccination became widespread? What is the measles vaccine that we're using now? For example, how effective is the vaccine? What are the recommendations for the general population? And then specifically, what are the recommendations for HIV patients based on what's known about the measles in this patient population? So by the end of this podcast, you know who should be vaccinated. And I'll also talk a little bit about PEP for people who are exposed to measles but are not previously immune. One thing I learned while preparing this podcast is that in HIV patients who are severely immunocompromised, the mortality from measles can be as high as 40%. Combine that scary statistic with the measles outbreaks that are going on around the country right now, and it certainly pays to have your HIV patients updated on their measles immunity. To get us started, I'm going to say a few words about why this is happening now when we weren't seeing measles outbreaks 20 or 30 years ago. Keep in mind that this problem is very complicated, and this is mostly my opinion. However, I did do some delving into this, and it's actually a fairly interesting history about vaccination success and vaccine hesitancy here in the United States. In order to understand this issue of vaccine hesitancy, I think it's really important to get right out there that this is not about simple stupidity or ignorance, and it's not about political expediency, but vaccine hesitancy is really a complex interplay between people's inherent biases, their approach to processing information and making decisions, which is quite variable, play of the success of vaccines in the past, perhaps so much that people really aren't afraid of these diseases as they used to be before vaccines. Everybody knew people who had had children die of these horrible childhood diseases, and now that's just simply not the case. There was also widespread beliefs in society that these public health problems could be and should be addressed, and that these diseases actually could be eradicated, and that we should do it because we could. There's also been a change in the emphasis in healthcare, placing more emphasis on decision partnerships between providers and patients instead of an inherent trust in physicians, and maybe more of just doing what the doctor says. That's not so prevalent as. And finally, the rise of misinformation that's always been present, but is maybe becoming more accessible because of the internet and acceptability of public health officials spreading misinformation. But it seems that vaccine hesitancy really comes down to individual decisions in the end. And I think understanding how people arrive at these decisions is definitely one key factor in getting more of our patients vaccinated properly. As far as personal bias, you'll find people that have all sorts of personal bias going into the vaccine decision. Some of us grew up in an environment believing in science and believing in statistics, and we are biased toward making decisions based on scientific evidence and statistics. I think other people grow up in an environment where they place more emphasis on anecdotes, personal stories. Perhaps they've heard about an adverse event caused by vaccines, and may be more likely to weigh that in making their decision than we would be weighing science and statistics. People are very poor at risk evaluation. We are all very poor at evaluating a risk versus benefit. And even then, when confronted with a risk versus benefit, many people are biased toward inaction instead of action. And if they find out that taking the action of, say, giving their child a vaccine has even a minuscule chance of adverse event versus not doing anything, some will choose not doing anything. And when they go out and start looking for information, obviously we all can become confused because there's so much misinformation out there. Misinformation is easily at hand if you go on the internet, start doing your own research. As of late, some of our top public health officials are also spreading misinformation, making people even more confused. And once that confusion sets in, it's definitely easier for some people not to do anything rather than actually take action, such as getting the proper vaccines. Some people are more biased towards believing in conspiracy theories. Some are more biased into believing in nature and letting nature take its course. And the list goes on and on. My real point being, all of us are biased one way or the other, and how we perceive the vaccine debate, go about gathering our information, and finally making decisions about vaccines is heavily weighted by those personal biases, and that people will come to different conclusions. Nonetheless, I think it's worth looking at what led up to a very high vaccination rate for measles, mumps, and rubella that started in the 1960s and progressed all the way through to the 1980s. Because by the 1980s, the United States had reached over 96% vaccination rate for measles, mumps, and rubella, which exceeded the target rate of 95% for herd immunity to protect the society at large. The timing of this campaign and success rate was certainly no accident, as it came on the heels of eradication of very deadly childhood diseases like smallpox, diphtheria, and polio the decade before. These were diseases that in the 1950s everybody knew about, and everybody knew somebody who was affected or afflicted by them. I remember stories from people who grew up during those times about how they were afraid to go to public pools lest they catch polio, no matter how hot it got in the summer. I even remember myself taking a tour of the hospitals as a child and seeing the rows of iron lungs that were now thankfully decommissioned in storage, but just imagining how it would be to see entire wards full of children who were using those machines for artificial respiration because of polio. So when these vaccines first became available in 1963, there was certainly a lot of fear, a lot more fear of childhood diseases than there are now. It was the ethos of the Great Society, the idea that preventing measles might be able to prevent mental retardation, which was believed to be caused by measles encephalitis. Early on, there was a great illustration of the success of requiring measles vaccines in a town that crossed the border of two states, Arkansas and Texas, during a time when one state required measles vaccination for school and the other state did not. The rate for children that lived on the side that didn't require vaccination was 12 times higher for measles during an outbreak than those that lived in the state that did require it. There were also huge public health campaigns that put out a scary message about the complications of measles, mumps, and rubella. There was a lot of publicity from public figures of the time, like the NFL, Captain Kangaroo, and Dear Abby. So between all of that and vaccine mandates, which were quickly put into effect around the United States, they did reach 96% vaccination rate by the 1980s. And at that time, measles was effectively eradicated from the country. And since then, until recently, nearly all cases of measles were imported from other countries or direct contact with imported cases. So what is the measles? In 1963, in a study in West Africa, measles killed 1 out of 5 children that were born. Measles in the United States pre-vaccination looked a little bit different. However, there were an estimated 3 to 4 million cases per year. Of those, about 50,000 hospitalizations and at least 1,000 deaths and evidence of permanent disability, mainly from brain damage from encephalitis. So overall, the mortality rate in the United States from the measles was estimated to be 1 to 3 deaths per 1,000 cases. By the year 2000, nearly all of those cases were sporadic, and the disease was considered eliminated from the country. The next question posed is, how effective is the vaccine? And I think those statistics pretty much show that the vaccine was extremely effective. More recent clinical trials show that 2 doses of vaccine produces 97 to 99% protection, and that for the most part, protection seems to be lifelong. In more current measles outbreaks, only 2% of cases were previously vaccinated, and those who did contract measles despite vaccination tended to have much more mild cases. Clinically, measles is a disease that's relatively easy to recognize for experienced clinicians. However, it poses a tremendous challenge because very few clinicians these days are experienced in seeing patients with the measles. The virus itself is an RNA respiratory virus. Humans are its only host. Clinically, it presents as fever and malaise, which are then followed a few days later by cough, coryza, which is inflammation of the mucous membranes of the nose, conjunctivitis, and then very typical rash, which is red and blotchy and generalized. Many report Koplik spots, which are those little white spots inside the cheeks that are quite specific to measles. Exposure period runs from 4 days before symptoms start to 4 days after the rash begins, and the clinical course can span up to 2 weeks. Measles is considered extremely contagious. It is spread by droplets and is also considered airborne. You can catch the measles up to 2 hours after a person with measles has left the room. 9 out of 10 people who are thus exposed will get infected, who are not already immune. So what are the current recommendations for the MMR vaccine in both people with and without HIV? And in here, I'm happy to report that I didn't find any significant differences in the guidelines put out by DHHS, the CDC, or New York State guidelines, and that worldwide, these guidelines seem to be pretty similar. That at least simplifies the process somewhat. So currently, the guidelines for the general population is that people receive 2 doses of either the MMR, or if your children under 12 can receive the MMRV, which also adds varicella. For adults who are not presumed to be immune, and I'll get to that in a minute, 1 dose of MMR vaccine is recommended. So briefly, a little bit about what is the measles vaccine. Remember, this is a live vaccine. It has live attenuated versions of the measles, mumps, and rubella virus. Because these are live versions, they are actually considered capable of producing disease or adverse events in highly immunocompromised people. The adverse event rate for immunocompromised people is very low, although it's not clear exactly what that is, since there are so many definitions of being immunocompromised. A very small number of children may experience a febrile seizure after receiving the vaccine, and about 1 in 20,000 cases of vaccination has been associated with ITP, idiopathic thrombocytopenia, which also usually appears to be self-limited. There is much feared potentially later complication of vaccine called panencephalitis, in which vaccine strain somehow reactivates in certain people, causing an encephalitis. This occurred in less than 1 in a million people, and it's worth pointing out that this occurs in about 7 to 300 out of a million people who actually have measles rather than the vaccine. So back to the recommendations in the general population. As I mentioned before, the recommendation is 2 doses of either MMR or for children age 1 to 12, MMRV vaccine. The recommendation is 1 dose of MMR for most adults who have no presumptive immunity, no need to screen for immunity, and in general, no need to test the titers of patients who receive the vaccine later in life. So what is presumptive immunity? Well, nearly everybody in the United States born before 1957 had measles and have presumed lifelong immunity. So in general, most of those people do not need vaccination or testing. So that applies to people who are 69 years and older. There are certain groups of people whom checking titers is recommended. These include people who are going to college, healthcare workers, contacts of highly immunosuppressed people, people living with HIV, and a group of adults who got the inactivated vaccine, which is actually fewer than 5% of all adults born between 1963 and 1967. Also, in general, during a measles outbreak, public health officials will come out with recommendations for who else may need to be screened for immunity. So as you can see, for HIV-positive people, the recommendation is to ascertain whether they're considered immune. Our recommendations don't currently single out HIV-positive patients born before 1957 to not get tested, although I would actually presume they are immune. In order to keep things simple, I like to test all of my HIV patients with titers to measles, mumps, and rubella, And our recommendations currently do recommend testing those patients when they come into care, as many of them may be born outside the country. Vaccination status is unclear. To keep it simple, that is something we include in our panel of new HIV patients. It also turns out to be very handy to have that on file because often when patients are applying for jobs, when they are working in healthcare, they do need to have evidence of MMR immunity. So we recommend testing all HIV positive patients at least once and keeping that information on file. Once tested, if they are immune with IgG positive, they don't need to be vaccinated or tested again. So what about HIV positive patients who are not immune to measles, mumps, and rubella? Well, the vaccination schedule for them is the same as for non-HIV positive people, and that is 2 vaccines given at least 1 month apart of the live MMR vaccine. A major exception is for HIV patients who are considered very immunosuppressed. Because this is a live vaccine, the potential for adverse events is higher in non-immunocompetent patients. And our recommendations are currently that HIV positive patients who have a CD4 count of less than or equal to 15% in children under 5, or in adults if their CD4 count is less than or equal to 15%, or their CD4 count absolute is less than or equal to 200, then we recommend that they are not vaccinated with the live MMR vaccine until after they are immune reconstituted. We like to see patients with a CD4% greater than or equal to 15 and a CD4 count greater than 200 for at least 6 months before giving the live MMR vaccine. Who else should not be given the MMR vaccine? Well, HIV patients who are pregnant and found to have negative titers should delay vaccination until after the pregnancy. Patients whose CD4 count may be above 200, however, are not virally suppressed, might have a lower response to vaccine. Although it's safe to give those patients MMR vaccine, might be worth considering delaying the vaccine until after they are virally suppressed to get perhaps a better response rate. In patients who are vaccinated while they are not virally suppressed, consider doing an MMR titers after the 2 doses of vaccine. If the titers are still negative, consider 2 more doses. I'll also say just a couple of words about post-exposure prophylaxis because there is an outbreak going on currently in the country, and it's conceivable that some of our patients may be exposed. If an HIV patient is exposed to the measles, getting an MMR titer, if their known MMR titer is negative and their CD4 count is greater than or equal to 200, they can receive the MMR vaccine if it's within 72 hours of exposure. If the CD4 count is less than 200 or it's more than 72 hours after exposure, then IVIG within 6 days of exposure is also considered effective post-exposure prophylaxis. It might be worth considering delaying MMR vaccination in patients who have had a severe illness recently until they're recovered, and those that obviously have a known allergy to the vaccine or severe immunodeficiency, or interestingly, who may receive a PPD or an IGRA, tuberculosis exposure screening test, within a few weeks after receiving MMR vaccine. That could cause false positives. In summary, measles is a very highly contagious disease. Death rate has been reported to be as high as 40% in people with advanced HIV. Currently seems to be making a comeback in the United States due to vaccine hesitancy and the lower rates of vaccination. Usually 90 to 95% of adults with HIV are immune to the measles already, but those born after 1957 should have at least proof of 2 MMR vaccines or positive titers to measles, mumps, and rubella, IgG. And anybody that doesn't fulfill that criteria, whose CD4 count is over 200 and over 14%, should be vaccinated with 2 doses of MMR vaccine at least a month apart. HIV patients born before 1957 with no proof of immunity may be a gray zone. Most of them can be considered immune. However, in patients who are concerned, or in order to keep things simple, I generally do perform the titer to prove immunity and consider vaccinating them if they qualify. This is Dr. Stephen Fine on behalf of the AIDS Institute for Clinical Education Initiative. Thanks a lot for listening.
Thank you for tuning in. Join us next time for a new episode of Conversations with CEI. Visit us at ceitraining.org and follow us on CEI social media platforms.